What's up, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Joshi Rambling. Happy New Year, everyone. Today, we're going to be having a conversation that I've been having fairly often on Reddit in particular recently, and I hate this question, so I'm going to have a whole discussion on how math works and why heavy bolters are the worst option you can put on your Leman sponsons basically all the time. And to do that, I kind of want to address a couple of things and introduce to some people. I hope some of you guys have seen this before, but one of my favorite websites in terms of I was gonna say League of Legends because I used to do that all the time. But in terms of 40K number crunching and helping to understand the game, and that is unitcrunch.com. So one of the major things that I want to start off with is understanding a little bit of how math works in 40K and how sustained hits and lethal hits and what these keywords actually mean and how effectively they can actually change different things in your army. So the first one that I want to kind of look at is we're going to go into Unit Crunch and talk about sustained hits. And to do that, we're going to have our theoretical lasgun, right? We're going to put this in. I'm not necessarily going to show you how to use this. It's like the UI is actually really good, so props to the guy who made this. But what we're going to do is we're going to take a theoretical lasgun where that has 36 attacks, ballistic skill 4, hitting on or strength 3, AP 0, damage 1. Okay, and it doesn't really matter what we're shooting it into. What we're going to really be looking at is this top right over here, right below like my actual camera. And normally you have this thing, right? If you click on summary, you can see that it is how much damage is actually done. However, we don't really care about that right now, and we usually this is useful for looking at when like one unit is shooting at another, but not as useful for when we're actually just comparing weapons. So let's go back. We're gonna hit in the top right. I will move my camera so you can kind of see it. There is the weapon results, summary weapon results, and I'm gonna put my camera back. Right. This is how video editing is done, by the way. So what we can look at here is a breakdown of what we're actually going to be expecting to see, right? We have 36 attacks. We're hitting on 4s, so we are expecting to hit 18 of them. Great. That makes sense. Now, let's take a look at what happens if I scroll down and give this +1 to hit. As you would expect, you see this number go from 18 hits to 24 hits, and this should intuitively make sense to us, right? When we roll 36 dice, we have we are expecting to hit half of them because 4 up is half. But when we go to hitting on 3s, we should expect to be hitting 2/3, which is 24, right? It's the same, or it's 24. Should be intuitive to us. However, what might not be as intuitive to some people is what happens when we hit this button and add sustained hits. It becomes 24. And that might not make sense to everyone at the very beginning. But what you have to think about is what the expected value of a die roll actually is. So normally, when you think of a die, it has 6 options, right? We'll put up 6. These 3 are, you get 1 hit off of hitting on these. However, these 3 options, you're getting a 0. And so that's what would happen if you're hitting on 4s. Now let's go back. We have our 6, and this time we only miss on these. So now we have 4 options that are going to be giving a 1 and 2 options that are giving us a 0. That means that on an average die roll, we're expecting to get 0.66 hits, or 2/3 of a hit. Now, the less obvious version of that is with sustained hits, we have 6 options, right? On 3 of them, we're going to miss if we're hitting on 4s with sustained hits. That's just a 0. However, we have 2 options where we're going to be getting a 4 or 5, and those are going to give us 1 hit. And then the last one, when we roll a 6, we're expecting to get 2 hits. And so suddenly, we are still, we get 2, 3, 4, and then 0. And that is the same as if we go, 6, 5, 4, 3, all getting 1. So that's 4 and 0. So we're still expecting the same number of hits. Sustained hits is the same as +1 to hit for practical purposes. It, in practice, actually makes like your actual results swingier. And so you can kind of see, like, if you take a look down here, the bell curve, you can see down to 16, it's like 1.9, and then all the way up, it changes. Whereas if you go with +1 to hit, 16 is very, very unlikely. So sustained hits is the same average. However, it makes your results swingier. You're expecting to not be as close to the middle. And so if you're trying to get like If you're trying to skew high and it's okay to skew low, like if you need to take a gamble, you prefer sustained hits than if you are taking +1 to hit. Okay, moving on. All right, so sustained hits is about the same as +1 to hit. Next, we're going to be looking at lethal hits, but we're going to compare it to +1 to wound. And for this, I'm going to change what we're shooting at. It doesn't really matter. But we're going to be shooting at Marines, right? We have strength 3 versus toughness 4. And in this situation, we're going to be looking at the wounds dealt, which is the number of times that they're going to have to save. So here, we would expect 18 hits, makes sense, and then 6 wounds because we are wounding on 5s. 1/3 of our hits should be converting into wounds. Okay, now we're going to turn on lethal hits. Well, boom. Right, we're going to be expecting 10 wounds dealt because we have 36 attacks, 6 of them automatically wound, and then of what's already coming through, we should expect 1/3 of those to go through as well. So we're going to be getting about 10 wounds here. However, if we get +1 to wound, instead, we're getting a very similar number, right? So what we generally understand from this is if we are going from wounding, if we have lethal hits, it is approximately equal. It's not quite as close as sustained hits is, but it's approximately equal to +1 to wound. You can also see this if we go, let's shoot at, so instead of wounding on 4s, let's go to something where we're wounding on 6s, right? With +1 to wound, we're expecting, is that right? We're expecting 6 wounds. Oh, right, because this is functionally wounding on, because this is wounding on 5s. However, lethal hits, here it's better. It's a little bit better going from 6s to 5s because now we're skipping the wounds roll entirely. I hope this has made sense to people, but the biggest thing to keep in mind, sustained hits is about the same as +1 to hit. Lethal hits is about the same as +1 to wound. However, if you're going from 6s to 5s, you prefer the lethal hits, but if you're going from wounding on 3s to 2s, you're going to prefer the it's about the same, right? Like, regardless, the major point is these are the heuristics that you should be thinking about when you're evaluating what these keywords actually are. Okay, with that math out of the way, if we are shooting a heavy bolter into a vehicle from one of our vehicles that has squadron and we are in combined regiment, it has sustained hits and lethal hits. A heavy bolter is basically a heavy bolter on anything else that has +1 to hit and +1 to wound. And it is still worse than anything else we could take. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at our sponson comparison. We're going to continue staying in the weapon results here. I'm going to take you through a bunch of hypothetical different things. So one of the major, actually, so I'm going to go ahead, oh look, that's my background today. That's not it. Where did it go? Ooh, you guys get a look at all of my fun stuff. Okay, I've had to have this conversation a bunch, and I'm going to call these people up because it annoys me. Oops, not that. So the major thing that I'm going to be talking about is I really don't care what you do in your own games. But the reason why I made this YouTube channel in the first place is because I see advice like this being given to new players. And new players who are new to 40K don't have context for whether or not like these different things are good, right? They don't have the intuition, they haven't played the game enough to actually be able to evaluate who is giving good advice and whether or not that advice is actually credible. So I've had to have this conversation multiple times. Here it is. This one was just a question from Iron Ninja, so thank you to that one. And then this one I had a couple of days ago with Alexius. And multiple times I've had to have discussions with people about why heavy bolters are not very good. And again, I don't mind if you are using heavy bolters in your own games. However, I'm trying to get people to give good advice to people who are new, people who are actually trying to get better at the game instead of just people who are used to playing previous editions. When previous editions, heavy bolters were totally fine, right? Heavy bolters were only like 5 to 10 points, and you could spend 20 to 30 points on multi-meltas or plasmas in order to get the good guns. However, the points that you were spending were not necessarily always good. Whereas in 10th edition, we don't pay for war gear. We are going to take the good guns. Do not take the bad guns. Take the good guns. And so let's go ahead and start looking at one of the things that we oftentimes see with comparing plasma cannons and multi-meltas to shooting at to shooting heavy bolters. And the first thing that we always have to do is we are generally going to go through and we have a bunch of different things that I've already preloaded into this unit crunch in order to kind of talk about them. The first one that generally people will say is they will say that when you are shooting at hordes, when you're shooting at guardsmen and other cultists and whatever, you should expect that the heavy bolter is going to be better. Oh, I was always doing the previous things with lethal hits. Oops. I'm not going to edit it. You guys can figure that out. I had double lethal hits, which doesn't do anything. Okay, so the argument is that heavy bolters should be better at clearing hordes. And the problem is they're not, right? So let's go ahead and take a look. So this is a guardsman equivalent. This is 10 guys that are toughness 3, 1 wound apiece, 5 up save. This should be very familiar to you if you play guard, if you play GSC. It's a little bit worse against like aspect warriors, which have like a 4 up save. But the major thing is that every single thing that we're going to do is going to showcase that the heavy bolter is not actually that interesting. And so now, as we're looking into it, the major thing, sometimes we care about the damage dealt against things that are multi-wounds in one model. However, in this situation, we care about the unsaved wounds because every unsaved wound is a dead model. And here, what we are seeing is that the heavy bolters, they get 6 attacks, 4 hits, 2.7 wounds dealt. Yeah, this all makes sense. But it's got 1.8 unsaved wounds. This is guardsman. This is supposed to be one of the ideal targets to be shooting our heavy bolters at. Okay? It is getting 1.8 unsaved wounds for 2 heavy bolters. And to be entirely fair, let's go ahead and give +1 hit in order to give take aim to all of these. So heavy bolters with +1 hit and sustained hits, no lethal hits because we're shooting at the wrong target, is 2.2 dead guardsmen on average. But as we look down, we can see that this is literally the worst into the thing that people are saying it's supposed to be shot at. It is half the number of guys are dying to heavy bolters as are dying to plasma cannons. It is the same. It is the same shooting into multi-meltas. Shooting multi-meltas at guardsmen is the same output as the heavy bolters. Heavy bolters do not do any damage. And heavy flamers, interestingly, not as good as plasma cannons here, but it's partly just because every single wound that a plasma cannon does is a dead guardsman. And then whereas heavy flamers, we're still only winning on 3s, and our opponents still actually have a save. So with all this in mind, the ideal target that a lot of people on Reddit are arguing about on why heavy bolters are good are not even better than multi-meltas. Okay, with that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at, let's go up 1. So we're going to take a look at marine equivalent. These are generally your intercessors, your jump pack, marines, whatever. They're generally going to be toughness 4, 2 wounds apiece, and a 3+ save. And once again, here we kind of have to do a little bit of math that we're looking at because heavy flamers being only damage 1, we actually care about damage dealt, or we can still go to unsaved wounds. We have to kind of divide this by 2. But anyway, we can once again see that into a unit of 5 marines, it's going to be heavy bolters are going to kill, on average, 1 marine per shooting activation. Plasma cannons are going to kill 2. Multi-melters are going to kill almost 2. And heavy flamers are going to kill a little bit less than 1 marine on average. And this is, again, supposed to be one of the things that the heavy bolters are supposed to be supposedly outperforming the plasma cannons and multi-meltas into. And once again, they don't. And it gets worse. I'm going to go ahead and edit this and change it from a 5-man unit to a 10-man unit, where the blast becomes even bigger and plasma cannons do even more damage from before. Because by the time they are shooting into a squad of 10 with the blast keyword, D3 plus blast is going to be a minimum number of shots better than the heavy bolters. Okay. Now, let's go ahead and keep on looking at these a little bit. I'm not going to harp on this too much, but you can see that into Terminators, heavy bolters, again, 0.4 unsaved wounds. That's less than a dead Terminator. This, you're starting to get with a plasma cannon, you're starting to get into the realm of probably a dead Terminator. Heavy flamers do basically nothing. And then multi-meltas, 0.9 unsaved wounds, and with an average damage of 3.5 per d6 damage. Multi-meltas, on average, are going to kill 1 Terminator. Now let's go ahead and start taking a look at vehicles. And here we can turn the lethal hits back on. And interestingly, we can see that the heavy bolter is actually almost the same, shooting at some of these light vehicles like a Rhino. You can see that it's still 0 0.8 unsaved wounds, and this is the major difference. This is like one of the few places where the heavy bolter is almost as good as the other ones. So heavy bolters here, unsaved wounds 0 0.8, and this is where the sustained hits are actually coming into play quite a bit. Plasma cannons kind of rely on their blast. They are expecting 4 attacks on average, whereas the heavy bolters always have 6, and with sustained hits, and +1 to hit, they're hitting an average of 5 attacks, whereas the plasma cannons are not getting as much. However, we can see that it is still a little bit less. The AP -1 as compared to the AP -3 is a pretty big difference. Heavy flamers, again, not really useful here. And multi-meltas, this is where we're really starting to cook. This is 3 times the damage dealt from heavy bolters, and almost the same going into plasma cannons. Multi-meltas are so much better against single model units like these vehicles. And as we continue climbing the ranks, so instead of a Rhino, let's go to a Predator, which is toughness 10. Heavy bolters starting to fall off a little bit because now they are winning on 6s, whereas the plasma cannons are still only winning on 5s, and that's where the major difference is. So even though you have 5 hits, 1.7 wounds, 2.7 hits, 1.3 wounds coming in from the plasma cannon, partly due to the lethal hits. Multi-meltas, though, really starting to cook. We are now in the more than double or more than triple heavy bolters and still like double plasma cannons. As we get tougher, start looking at a Leman Russ equivalent, it starts to get more and more stark here, right? 0.3 unsaved wounds from heavy bolters is 0.5 damage. Plasma cannons 1.3. Multi-meltas, this is 6 times the damage of multi-meltas into a Leman Russ as what you would expect from a heavy bolter. And still, what is that, 2.5 times the plasma cannons? I'm not even talking about heavy flamers anymore because they're irrelevant. And lastly, Land Raider. This should be pretty much identical from what you expect, right? Look at that, 0.6, 3.1, because at this point, everything is not changing between shooting at a Leman Russ and a Land Raider. Anyway, so I hope this has been good evidence that the heavy bolters are not going to be doing any damage to anything. They do not outperform a plasma cannon or a multi-melta into any target that we have looked at so far. There is, however, one target that I think the heavy bolter actually does more damage into, and that is like Nurglings. And so we kind of have to think about that. One, the strength 7 or 8 from a plasma cannon versus strength 5 from a heavy bolter doesn't matter. You're basically winning on 2s or 3s regardless. You aren't getting blast into these targets because it's less than 5 models. So it's like 3 models of Nurglings, and so then the heavy bolter consistent number of shots actually outperforms. The AP doesn't matter from a plasma cannon because the Nurglings have an invul save and they don't have an armor save, and they're multi-wound models. So I mean, the heavy bolters are really doing well into these targets. But I'm gonna be honest, if you are having trouble killing Nurglings in your army, it is not that is not a major issue with the guns. It's a major issue with the rest of your army. Okay, I want to go ahead and also get ahead of one of the major arguments that I am also seeing from people who are arguing for heavy bolters instead of plasma cannons or multi-meltas, and that is that heavy bolters can shoot into your combat. This is true. Plasma cannons, even on a demolisher cannon, cannot shoot into engagement range because it has the blast keyword. And the major thing here is everything except a plasma cannon can shoot into melee. So let's go back and look at the let's look at the guardsmen, right? Here, even here, the heavy bolters are barely turn off lethal hits, are identical to the multi-meltas in terms of like shooting things off of you when you are in combat. It doesn't matter. It is still the same as the multi-meltas. Heavy flamers do actually outperform here, but they do so little damage into anything else, we don't care. So this is kind of an argument. It's like, what happens when your tanks get tagged? And my response to that is, that's a skill issue, not a gun issue. You do have to play slightly differently between plasma cannons and multi-meltas. If you are playing a plasma cannon, I would recommend taking a look at, I'll throw it up above here, 1950. I'll keep that one in mind for the timestamp. that is where you have to decide, do you want your Russes to be playing a like mid-board role, like playing a Demolisher or a sometimes your Exterminators or your Vanquishers. You want to put multi-meltas on these so that you can move them up into the mid-board and they can still shoot into their combat. But if you're going to be putting plasma cannons on things like your tank commanders or maybe your Leman battle tanks or whatever, you do not necessarily want to put these in places where they can get tagged by melee because then they have to shoot or they are stuck with guns that they can't shoot themselves out of a combat. So you do have to play them differently based on how you have the plasma cannons and multi-meltas. And then the last major part here is um, heavy bolters do have a range advantage over multi-meltas. They do not have a range advantage over plasma cannons. They're both shooting at 36 inches, but they do have a range advantage going up against multi-meltas. And there are some weird boards where this might be useful. Like Games Workshop has like Pariah Nexus 6, where heavy bolters like might be relevant, but the major thing to look at, actually no, I'm gonna pull this up so that people know what I'm talking about. Except we're gonna go here, not indexes, core rules, Pariah Nexus tournament companion. Okay, so I just want to talk about the terrain a little bit and why the extra range doesn't really matter. And it's generally accepted that layout 6, layout, we don't really ever play on layout 5 except in like teams events. But layout 6 is generally like the most open um, board that we tend to play on. And here, there are some firing lanes that are more than 18 inches. So basically, from the edge of, oh, you can't see my mouse, but from the edge of the two ruins in the middle towards the other is a little bit more than like 20 inches. So if you have like a 24-inch gun, you're going to be able to shoot between them. However, if you are, the reason why we still don't care about the 36 here is because it's not a 18-inch range that we really have with these guns. It's a 28-inch range because we have a 10-inch move. And from here, the only things that are more than 28 inches so that our meltas are never really impactful are along the sides of the board, and we are shooting corner to corner. So even on this one, there's not a lot of firing lanes where that's particularly relevant. On Games Workshop 1 or Pariah Nexus 1, there are some fairly long ones on this one, but you're not necessarily going to be taking shots from one corner of the L to the other. That's why you generally take a unit with plasma cannons, and anything with multi-meltas is going to be hiding out in these big L's in the middle of the board. You have to play these units a little bit differently depending on the terrain. However, this is something that you will generally know beforehand before you actually get to any competitive event. So, as long as you are keeping this in mind, the heavy bolters are always worse. You never want to take the heavy bolters on any kind of sponson. That said, let's go ahead and back up a little bit and talk about where else you would take heavy bolters. So you would end up taking heavy bolters on vehicles that don't have another option, right? If you take a Basilisk or a Manticore or a Hellhound, or not a Hellhound, a Hydra. So any of these, your options are a heavy bolter or a heavy flamer. And for these ranged ones that are more artillery that are actually trying to shoot at long range down the board, you're going to take the heavy bolter instead of the heavy flamer because the heavy flamer won't be able to shoot like at all, and even the things that does shoot, it's not going to do any damage into. The one time where I think there's a real argument as to whether or not you should take a heavy bolter or something else is on a Chimera. Now, Chimeras have an option of heavy bolter or heavy flamer. You can take two of either of them, one on the turret, one on the body. And this is actually a pretty interesting discussion to have, but in general, the thing to think about is the heavy bolters are relying on being paired with a ton of other shots. You have 6 heavy bolter shots coming out from a Chimera, and then you have like 18. You have a heavy stubber and the lasgun array, I think it's called, that are also just putting out a volume of lethal hits that your opponent has to deal with. And that's pretty interesting, especially if you want to put like an Ogre Bodyguard or some Kazarkin that are going to shoot their plasmas out of the top. That's pretty interesting. However, the other thing that you're going to be looking at with this is a vehicle that is going to be really far in the front lines. You're going to be charging it into things. It's going to be in combat with things all the time. It is going to be charging chaff. And because it is actually a unit that has sometimes will have a role of I want to go kill guardsmen, I want to go kill cultists, I want to go kill aspect warriors by moving around the corner and then flaming them on the objective. The heavy flamer actually is pretty good into these targets. So once again, looking at the guardsman equivalent here, the 2 heavy flamers coming out from a chimera actually does more into some of the things that we are trying to shoot at. So you kind of have to make a decision there on whether or not you want your chimeras, your transports, which are going to be pretty far up the board. Do you want them to contribute firepower into like vehicles and monsters, where the lethal hits of the heavy bolters is really good, or are you going to be hunting like MSU, Scout Marines, Guardsmen, Cultists, where the flamers actually start being the better choice? Now, the only other time where we look at the heavy bolter and we're like, yeah, that's pretty interesting, is on hellhounds. Because hellhounds, they have two things. One, they strip cover, but they don't care which weapon strips cover. You just need to get one hit. And as we looked at with a couple of those terrain things, a hellhound sometimes really needs the range, right? A hellhound with the meltas, it's going to get, if you don't have take aim, which you usually don't give it, you're going to have a 75% chance of stripping cover with a multi-melta if you're in range, and you're going to have an 87.5% chance, a 7 out of 8, I think, chance of stripping cover with the heavy bolters, which is better, and it is at longer range. So that one is another interesting time where sometimes you take heavy bolters. However, I hope through watching this video, you've learned to use Unicrunch a little bit better, and you are going to stop recommending new players put heavy bolters on any of their Leman Russes or their Rogal Dorns. We always want to take the multi-meltas into everything. We always want to take multi-meltas or plasma cannons. There's strong arguments for both of them. Not going to get into that. That's the topic of another video. For now, though, it's been Josh with Joushi Howard. I hope you guys have enjoyed the new year, and stop taking those heavy bolters, guys. We'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.